Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alasdair Blair. I work at Montfort University. Welcome to tonight. We have hopefully some lively questions that are going to come our way. I'm joined by Michael Hindley, who's a former member of the European Parliament. Michael has had a long career working in the European Parliament. Was a former vice president of the External and Economic Affairs Committee. And in the context of tonight, he also leads the Former Members Association of the Europe, which deals with the European Parliament campus activities. So he's the key person who's organising European Parliament to campus, and that's what we've got on tonight. Michael, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I wanted to, if I may, just make a few, as it were, opening reflections. The first one is this much quoted but very accurate statement at the end of the Second World War by the US Secretary of State, Mr. Acheson, who said that Britain's dilemma was that it had lost an empire but not yet found a role. And for some 40 odd years, the British, we tried to find that role through cooperation with the common market, and I'll call it the EU, as being members of it. And that has come to an end, which really is end of an era. And the big question is how we now continue. What will our relationship be with the EU as opposed to what our relationship was in the EU? The second reflection is to say I was lucky enough during my career that my time in Strasbourg coincided with the kind of genuinely epoch-making clash between Mrs. Thatcher and Jacques Delors, at the heart of which was very much in which direction should Europe go? Should it be simply a common market, an internal market, or should it be a market plus on the continental model of a social market? And that is still with us, and as may come out later, contributed considerably to the decision and the debate around Brexit. I try to explore this in some of my writings. My third reflection is quite staggering for even myself to think of. In 1980, I married my Polish wife in Poland. It was the beginning of the Solidarity strikes, opposition, which eventually led to the liberation of Poland and Eastern Europe. But if you'd have told us in 1980 that in 2020, my wife, as a Polish citizen, had more mobility in the EU than I, as a British passport holder, you would have thought I was mad or dreaming, or this would never happen. But that's the situation that we're now in. And that's where we have to move on from in some form or other. But I hope that suffices, Alasdair, to give a little flavour.
I think it is a sort of three really important points, and the third one, in a way, is somewhat most profound in terms of what we see as the opportunities going forward. Waiting for questions to come forward in the chat. Hopefully we'll get some of that soon. Reflecting on that point about Mrs. Thatcher, and who did have some fairly testy relationships with Europe, but on the other hand, was, when she first came to office, was actually viewed as being actually a very pro-European individual, particularly after the government that had gone before. When she then left office, was a view that she was not the most helpful individual. Do you think that Mrs. Thatcher would have even thought that the UK would have left the European Union if she was alive today at that time?
Just not think. You may remember her chief foreign affairs advisor was Charles Pole, who pronounced his name Pole, although he's the brother of Jonathan Powell, who advised Tony Blair. And he said it very revealingly afterwards. He said, I've been asked often in the debate about what Margaret Thatcher would have voted for and campaigned for in Brexit. And he said, I can tell you now, on the record, I'm absolutely certain that Margaret Thatcher would have stayed in the EU and battled on, as she always did and could, for Britain in the EU. And you can't get a clearer indication than that. It's overlooked, not least by the Tories. I don't want to make too many political points in this. It's not a party political debate. But Mrs. Thatcher was very, very much in favour of the completion of the internal market. Mm-hmm. One of my favourite slides when I do lectures is a photograph of Mrs. Thatcher in 1975 under the banner of which says, Conservatives say yes to Europe. Mrs. Thatcher wanted the market. Mrs. Thatcher saw the opportunity. The 75 big vote for staying in the EU was very much business-led. Thatcher started to have her reservations when two things, first of all, when the old question of sovereignty, the primacy of European law, but generally on sovereignty, but was very, very keen on taking up the market. She became very nervous and said, again, very revealingly, she'd not rolled back socialism in Britain, which is, if you're on the left, is quite a strange idea that we had it. But Mrs. Thatcher said, I didn't roll back socialism in Britain to have it imposed by the EU. And this is where she clashed with Delors, who was very much in the tradition of Catholic progressive thought, left of centre in Europe. And that was the big clash. Everything else, the move to Brexit starts really there, but that's still very much at the core of the European debate. It's the old argument, the goldest argument of, is should Europe be a United States of Europe, i.e. federal, moving towards integration, or should it be a nation of United States? Thatcher in many ways was a goalist. So that's still there, and that's at the root of the Brexit. And it's now, if you roll on, it's re-emerging in the current discussions about Poland and Poland's sovereignty and Poland's rule of law and so on.
Yeah, but I think I suppose if we were to look back and you could read Thatcher's memoirs and you could look at the politicians who've also come after Thatcher and their views of Europe. Thatcher was also a very respected politician, despite maybe popular press in terms of either demonising her from a European perspective at times, sort of her handbag of Delors treatments, etc. But she was also respected for being a tough politician and someone who negotiated hard.
Yes.
And I wonder then if you're to sort of go forward to say a politician, I know it's not a political discussion, but someone like David Cameron, who in a way I think treated the Brexit vote a bit like the Scottish referendum vote, that his popularity or his capacity to win the referendum, but at the same time was maybe a less serious politician. And maybe when we think about Brexit, the full consequences of that, and coming to tonight's discussion, was not really fully understood by either the population as a whole or by the politicians themselves.
Yes. See, I remember quite well as a younger person the 1975 referendum, which again was a curious event because we joined on a House of Commons vote, constitutionally correct. The House of Commons is sovereign. So the House of Commons on a split vote, Ted Heath only saw off the challenge by people who nowadays would be Brexiteers when the Labour Party, which for opportunistic reasons had voted against Heath's settlement, split as well. And the, as it were, pro-EU wing, led mainly by Roy Jenkins, voted with Heath. So people either ignore or forget that it wasn't a party issue in those days. And Harold Wilson, and this is where Cameron comes in, Harold Wilson fought the 74 election on a very clever position, because the Labour Party was split, of saying, where have you heard this recently, he would renegotiate the terms of entry and put it to a referendum. Now, this is where Cameron comes in, because Harold Wilson, whatever its demerits, Harold was a very wily politician, and Harold was sufficiently vague in what he promised he would renegotiate. It was difficult to prove he'd failed in a way. Yeah. So he finessed that very well. Now, Cameron, main reason, I think everyone agrees with this, for the referendum was very much party political in a sense, in that it was to try to pull the Labour Party, Freudian slip, pull the Conservative Party together. He was doing it because he was afraid of the rise of UKIP, which was eating into the Tory vote. And in a way, he sought to challenge his own backbenchers, his own UKIP voters, his own putative Brexiteers. He tried to challenge them by saying, back me or sack me. He also said he would renegotiate the terms of reference. Now, unlike Wilson, he was not vague. He brought immigration into the equation and said that by leaving he didn't say he would do it, but he would make immigration an issue and therefore try to negotiate better terms on immigration. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but of course, this is against the fundamental principles of the Treaty of Rome, freedom of movement. Now, again, if Cameron, my view, many people's view, I think Cameron could have finessed this in the standard European way of, in principle, we will keep freedom of movement, but then seeking some kind of consensus about how that freedom of movement might be qualified. Again, it's on the record that Merkel was quite happy to bring in some consideration of restrictions relating to social security payments. Could people come here looking for a job? You know, if they were unemployed after a certain time, could they be sent back to their native country and so on? There was a considerable room for maneuver there. And Cameron could have pulled a rabbit out of the hat, but he nailed his colour to the mast of bringing down the number of immigrants. And the EU was quite entitled to say publicly, no, you signed up for this. Mm-hmm. Behind the scenes, they're all saying, yes, we can finesse this. So, you know, to use, it's the obvious hoist by his own petard. I think if Cameron had not tried to buy off his own right wing with throwing immigration into the equation, he could well have won that referendum. Once he'd said, he didn't say, he said it would be consultative, but he'd honour it. He was then stuck with it. And poor old Mrs. May had to enact it. Again, it's a criticism, not so much a party political criticism, but if at that stage, I'll pose another scenario, which I think would have worked, if at that stage, as was done in Scotland, when there was talk about independent Scotland referendum act, if Mrs. May had said we must have some kind of constitutional cross-party discussions about how we actually achieve a different status with the EU, then again, I think we would have come to a solution far better than what we actually signed up to, and one which would have been the basis for a consensus. So it really is the ill judgment of Cameron trying to keep the Tory party together, and then Mrs. May, seeing the issue of our relationship with the EU as simply being a Tory party issue, that's made such a mess. I'm sure people might dispute that. I think many people, especially in Europe, would agree that that's a fairly objective statement of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things here is, I suppose, some European countries will miss the UK. Maybe all of them will miss the UK as a member of the European Union. And one of the things there is that UK has, at times, if not consistently, been a vocal advocate for free movement, liberty, on trade grounds primarily, but also has sometimes been an antagonist, have been against particular policies. Now, maybe the UK has just been too open in flying its colours from the mast, whereas other countries have in the past hidden behind the UK and have not been so public with their diplomacy.
I think that's absolutely spot on, Alasdair. Many people in the Thatcher period hid behind Margaret Thatcher's skirts. She was saying things that others wanted Britain to say. When you go back a step, as it were, about other countries' reactions, the joke that's been going around Brussels for a while now that stems from Brexit is that in Brussels, the French come up to the British and say, "What are you doing? You realize you've left us with the Germans." And the Germans come up to the Brits and said, "You realize what you've done? You've left us with the French." And that was always the tension, creative tension, that Britain split up the Paris-Berlin, Paris-Bonn in those days axis. It was the smaller countries that wanted Britain in. There's no question about that. It's interesting that the Dutch government now doesn't have the economic political clout, but the poor old Dutch have been saddled with the British role as the one who constantly says, "Hold on a minute." Yes, it's completely changed the balance, and people of sense and people who are genuinely interested in kind of pan-European configuration are not at all happy about the British leaving. To say two further things, as it were, on that, in the European Parliament or in the Commission or even the Council of Ministers, everyone will say, if you want to get through a meeting, put a Brit in the chair. Man, woman, Lib Dem, Green, Tory or Labour, because the British pragmatically will go through the agenda. And that now will be badly missed. The other encouraging thing is you'll have noticed that Mr. Scholz, the Chancellor designate of Germany, was interviewed very briefly, and someone obviously shouted out about Brexit. And being a Hamburger, his English is excellent. And Scholz just said, "We didn't want you to leave, and we'd like you back." So this synthetic hostility that we see almost daily in the British press is not a reflection of what key decision makers, opinion formers are thinking in the EU. It was met with some kind of puzzlement, some sense of disappointment, but they have to accept it. But it's one that doesn't contain the bitterness that the impression that particularly the British press gives of the situation. Many people there, key decision people, would be happy to get us back, but it's much too early to start that process.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe that's a later question if it comes up, and that's years down the line on the one hand, but on the other hand, I mean the press is an interesting state of affairs in the UK. Partly the power of the press. Also, there's an argument for the decline in the quality of it, and I don't want to sort of list any particular newspapers tonight, but one of the elements there is also the decline in foreign reporting,
Yes.
and reporting of embedded journalists. And you could also say that about not just the printed press, but media in general, and having informed discussions based upon your correspondent in Rome, Paris, Berlin, and further afield. Do you think that has an impact on this tidal wave of populism in general, that in some ways is eroding democracy, not just in Europe, but also at a global level?
Yes, very, very much. I mean, if you there's many examples of this decline, and the decline of print journalism, and so on, and the decline of the BBC, particularly the rise of Murdoch and Murdoch's decision to come out all guns blazing against the EU, which I think correctly can be claimed to find its roots in the evidence that Brussels, the EU, takes a stronger line on monopoly control than nation state like Britain. That's the hostility that's there in Murdoch, as well as the idea that populism increasingly sells. It's not too long ago that the Daily Telegraph, always called the Daily Torygraph, that's clear where its loyalties lie. But the Daily Telegraph used to have more correspondence in the field than any other newspaper. And it no longer does. It's taking stuff from the wires, as they call it, and it's taken from desk journalists in London. And that's true of other newspapers. The other thing that's always been apparent, I mean, throughout my life, I went to university in Berlin in the 60s. For a number of reasons, for another discussion on another day, the world, and certainly Europe, takes more notice of Britain than Britain has ever taken of Europe. That's, again, understandable. But don't forget that the decision makers right down to the present generation were children of the Second World War. And Britain came out of that with prestige. And that lasted a very long time. So, interest in Europe, interest in Britain from Europe was never really reciprocated by an interest in Britain for things in Europe. Even now, there's more attention paid to us. To some extent, it's I always tell people to you come across academics, intellectuals, people in public life in Britain who really know very, very little about what's going on in continental Europe. I mean, there's people who, the British intellectuals, love France, but it's very rare that they take an interest in political life in France. People in remote corners of Europe will know about Johnson, will know, not because he's such a foolish man and a headline grabber, but they keep it up to date with things in Britain where the British scarcely bother. I doubt. If you ask the foreign correspondents or political journalists to tell you, who's in the running for the German chancellorship or the runners and riders in the French elections, I mean, these are very, very important events for Europe. But you can bet that the people who take an interest in politics in general, in Germany and France and Poland and Sweden, are fairly clued up about what's going on in this country.
Yeah, I think that has a significant impact, doesn't it? Right, when we sort of think about the future. Recently, the press has been reporting about a fishing vessel being stopped in the channel there, and that's been a headline news. And yet,
Yes.
at the same time, there are other quite profound issues happening, not just in Europe but further afield. So if we think to the future of the UK after Brexit, only recently we've annoyed the French by signing up to provide nuclear-powered submarines along with America to Australia. That seems to have gone down very badly in France. And yet, from a strategic point of view, the UK should have very close military ties with France, given they're both nuclear powers.
Yes.
They are key members of NATO. To what extent do you think the UK's attempt to pivot potentially further to America or into Australasia will then have a negative impact on the UK's position in NATO in particular?
Well, there's and then I'd also like to move on to the related question of our trade relations as well. Yes, I mean this again is a puzzle in many ways to me, as well as many people, our relationship with France. Someone pointed out today that since Waterloo, Britain fought with France in the Crimea and twice fought as allies to defend France in world wars, and yet this enmity persists, and in many ways is artificial. That's for certain. Again, I'll tell you a story, as it were, out of school. Apparently, this is true. When Heseltine was the defense minister, his aide was I better carry on. What was it? His name? Maitland. Maitland?
Yeah, Maitland, yeah.
Yes. He told him to, at his level, to have talks with the French, because we were both nuclear powers, and told him to, there's diplomatic links, come to tea, have general chats. And then Maitland said this was well accepted, greeted, and Heseltine was pleased about that. And then Maitland said the French won't talk anymore because they want to go to a higher level. And Heseltine said, well, I can't take it to a higher level as Minister of Defence, really, without now checking with number 10. And the answer came back, 0, stop, veto, because the key commitment was, Reagan, transatlantic, and so on. So yes, it defies logic, doesn't it, that there is this non-cooperation really with France, and this bubbles up. It also provides a standard British delusion that there is some special relationship with the USA. When the USA via NATO goes into Afghanistan, the Brits will go with them. There's no question. And when the Americans, for their own reasons, pull out of Afghanistan, there's no way that the British are going to stay in Afghanistan without the Americans. To credit Tony Blair, I think Tony Blair was the only Labour person, perhaps the only British person, politician, who recognised that Britain's value to the USA was that we were members of the EU. I always argued, I've been very critical, remain critical of aspects of American foreign policy, but I've always argued that Britain, this was a real ace card, that Britain is a natural link between Europe and the USA. And we never fully exploited that in the best sense. We never now, that could have been a key argument in the Brexit debate. The Americans, again, good or bad, did Obama put his foot in it or not by saying that, back of the queue? But it was a genuine appeal by Obama, and it was a genuine statement of the fact that Britain went down several places. Trump was an idiot, we know that. Trump was just, playing the American card. But once we're not in the EU, why on earth should America, deal with us? They're going to deal bilaterally with the EU. They don't need an intermediary. And there's been a bit of a scramble. I've written about this, amongst the France. France even greeted Trump with all French pomp. Biden, his chief advisor, is a Francophile, Francophone. There's a bit of a scramble going on for who's going to be America's best friend in Europe. That brought us some suspicion. De Gaulle was very uneasy about having Britain in because of our relation with the USA, but nonetheless, on the whole, it was a key position which, credit to Blair, he acknowledged, and we've simply lost that. Now, when Biden has his global vision and so on, he's very, very keen to come to some understanding with Macron, smoothing the feathers about the nuclear subs and so on. He's going out of his way. He made the speech, didn't he, saying how much France owed given to America and so on. And when somebody, BBC man, caught up with Biden when Biden was campaigning, and the man shouted out, as the reporters do, he shouted out, Mr. Biden, BBC. And Biden turned round and shouted back, BBC, I'm Irish.
I remember that well.
Key moment. And we've lost that. So, now Britain goes back and says, special deal. America says, there's 60 million of you. And there's 500 million in the European Union. And you used to be our bridge to the 500 million. And now there's just you 60 million. We've lost major cards in our hand.
Yeah. And we've got a question from Anjanette, who just come up on the chat there, says, do you think the potential election of Michel Barnier is a worry for the EU?
I don't think it's a worry. If you mean, in reality, as I said before, especially since the UK is out, we've really gone back to the Paris-Brussels axis. So there'll be a different reaction. First of all, particularly the Germans will be very keen to see who emerges. And I think the other countries will be looking very keenly to see who wins in France and what their relationship will primarily be with Germany, and also what that French president will bring in that special relationship with Germany, which is to the benefit of the whole of the EU. Now, if you voted on that basis, which I doubt many French people will vote, Barnier is a strong candidate. Barnier is a strong candidate. I think other things are going on in France that will prevent him coming through. I think it will be a national election, as we've had in the past, between stopping Le Pen, or if this other person, Zemmour, comes through, it will be, do you wish to stop the right-wing nationalists winning? And this is going to boil down to voting for Macron. And I would imagine, we spend time in France, that this will put Macron ahead in the first ballot. And although Barnier has a strong portfolio, it is not a one which will appeal in the domestic election. He's yet to get the nomination anyway of the Republican Party. I understand, we have a very close friend who are living in France, that he's not, put it this way, in the kind of election that will come up next year, he's seen as the diplomat above this, when it's going to be quite a tough domestic battle. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think if you if you did the kind of people who are interested in the fate of Europe and not living in France, you'd probably want Barnier to be the president. But I don't think his position and his strengths are ones that will appeal to the electorate there. But the rest of the EU, I think, will be, well, not the right, be careful. So I think elements, right-wing elements as well, might welcome significant showing. I don't think anybody would expect Le Pen to win, but I think some of the populists in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary might welcome a good show by the French nationalists. But no, he's got the wrong qualities, really.
Okay. So if we think about the UK, you mentioned trade.
Yes. Sorry,
some time back.
Yeah.
And I suppose.
Go on, please.
Well, I was going to say that. I mean, it's an interesting state of affairs in the UK at the moment. We've just had a budget, which taxes are now the highest they've been in nearly half a century in terms of people's the impact on people's income. Relatively speaking, there's been not much wage growth for a decade or so. Unemployment is low, but many people's standards of living are going backwards rather than forwards, you could argue, in terms of broader societal changes and benefits. And then we're told that Boris is going to try and ensure that he will save Christmas because of potential impacts on the border. But where does that really leave the UK in terms of its trading relationships with Europe and the opportunity to both be a prosperous trading nation and at the same time not just to end up being a low-wage nation in the future?
Yes, again, this has a long kind of history, doesn't it? But I'll not spend too much time back there. But again, that was always from Thatcher onwards, and then when Brexit seemed to be a threat and then a reality, the worry was that Britain would become this offshore, unregulated competitor for the EU. Now, for a number of reasons, that isn't working and hasn't happened yet. My own view of this Singapore-on-Thames is nonsense, because Singapore is a small island of 5 million people who realistically can all become stockbrokers or consultants. We're a nation of 60 million, and it's harder to provide what's good for life, limb and spirit in a nation of 60 million as opposed to one of 5 million. So there was that worry that we would nonetheless become this offshore dumping ground, as it were, for lower standards. And that still is a worry, if I can say that. Then if I try to update that, see 40%, 40% of our trade is with the EU. It is difficult to see that coming down significantly and the amount of so-called free trade with other entities rising to such an extent that they kind of overtake each other. So the EU is going to be our major economic trading partner for any foreseeable future. And therefore, our relationship with the EU has to be a better one than the one that we have negotiated. And sadly, the Labour Party, my party, seems to have gone along with that. Now, in a way, you can prove you're successful by these trade deals that we're making with the Faroe Islands and New Zealand and so on. But they are in no way going to compensate for the loss of trade that comes about through simple, shall we say, border problems in trading with Europe. There was again a very interesting interview with the New Zealand, a much admired PM, Jacinda Ardern, where she quite frankly said, I cannot understand. This is a deal that's a disaster for the UK, and it gives New Zealand more than we'd ever hoped of getting. But even then, it's not going to be 1% of our trade. And leaving aside, it's COP26, how much it's going to cost to bring all that New Zealand meat in terms of environment over to us. Now, in the EU, same as I mentioned with the USA, New Zealand would have to do a trade deal wanting access to a market of 500 million. And British, Lakeland, Welsh sheep farmers will be getting more protection in a trading entity with 500 million for their domestic production than Britain can offer, having in many ways sold the pass, because the New Zealanders, the Australians know we're desperate to show that we are successfully negotiated in the wider world. And this will, I think, the disillusionment will turn into some more profound political criticism more quickly than people realize. You get the feeling now there's a certain feverish activity in the government proving it's all a great success, when in fact what is achieved is nowhere near going to compensate for the loss of trade. I bet that we've lost more trade simply between Britain and Ireland and Northern Ireland than we could ever make up with a trade deal with New Zealand, Australia, Faroe Islands. If I can just add another bit about multilateralism and the need for it and the commitment to it. The EU remains still committed to multilateral regulation through the UN, but through the WTO. It's regrettable in many ways that Britain will leave that camp. Within the EU, having said that, back to Thatcher, Britain was a free trader in the world and within the EU. So a detrimental effect now for Germany, France, is that, and Holland, that Britain was on their side as exporters, minus Britain's commitment to trading within a multilateral bloc. You're going to hear much more protectionism in particularly Eastern Europe for their domestic industries. So in that way, there'll be a detrimental effect for the EU. Many progressive trade policies, particularly the commitment to multilateralism, will start sliding back within the EU.
Well, I think if we take then the UK and we were to sort of cast forward, we're in 2021, we were to end up in 2030 or 2040. I'm Scottish by my accent. Do you think Scotland would be an independent country in the European Union in 10 years' time?
Gosh, as long as you don't promise to veto Britain's bid for re-entry.
Okay, well, that's one answer. I suppose, I guess the thing...
I think that yes, I'm not sure about independence, but I certainly think that the move to more devolution within the constituent parts, I think the more... I'm not sure about Scotland in 10 years. I'm more sure that Ireland will be united in 10 years.
Okay. Which then does have a profound impact also on the UK as
well.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
In a broader context.
Yes.
If we sort of take all of this sort of full circle or sort of think about it, I mean, it is interesting that we hear in the paper, on the news or in the papers about debates about lorry drivers and shortage of key supply. Now, in a way, Brexit was sold to the electorate as a whole as there will be happy times in the future, and we will be a very prosperous, independent country, and we will not be bogged down by regulation. I don't think anyone at that time ever thought there'd be a shortage in getting a milk delivery, or there'd be a shortage potentially in making sausages at Christmas time for chipolatas, or there'd be a difficulty in many industries. And that has an impact potentially down the line in the way in which our own economy operates, because we operate whereby you go into a Marks and Spencer's, a Tesco, etc. All the products are on the shelves because there's nothing in the warehouse, because the warehouse sits somewhere else, and that's a just-in-time kind of system, isn't it?
Yes.
So down the line, there are profound shifts in the nature of how our country operates based upon shortage of labour supply.
Yes.
Do you think that's going to get worse for us as a country over the coming years, or do you think we're going to solve this?
I think certain things will, my hope, but also my expectation, is that even without a push for those of us who want a closer relationship, I think it's premature to talk about rejoining. There are certain practical things that the government will have to do, which are a loosening of regulations. It's interesting that in the latest exchanges with Mr. Frost, Baron Frost, he has accepted, apparently, that in a limited way, the European Court of Justice will have a role in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, you and I know that the European Court of Justice has always had, in a limited way, a role to play. It's not been the heavy stamp of you must do this because it's European law, or we'll take you to the ECJ. It's never been that. The Poles are trying the same trick now, and it won't work. So I think there'll be more and more concessions like that. You know, they will find there's not enough Polish lorry drivers going to come and drive lorries for 2 weeks or 2 months to Christmas. You know, they'll find that they need those lorries to keep going after Christmas. And then they'll have to extend the period and the conditions and so on. When they find out that enough British people are not trained to be lorry drivers, there'll have to be a more permanent relationship to fill these labour shortages. Now, you'll be back then to what the Brits in many ways always had, you know, in the EU, but with a list of exceptions. And I think this might happen very, very quickly, because once they start saying that, well, the lorry drivers can come here, and perhaps for longer, perhaps we can extend the permits for the French to fish, would delay the new rules until Christmas, until next year. Then you've got to start saying, well, you know, what about the Erasmus program? Perhaps that can be introduced in a limited way for proven research purposes. So this, in order to stay afloat, as it were, this government is going to have to relax what they've sold to the public, that we hold all the cards and they need us more than we need them. And so there'll be a kind of re-engagement by stealth. And fairly soon, I think, we'll find that the list of exceptions leads inevitably to the idea of, hang on a minute, should this be formalized, not by rejoining, but by having a better legal basis for our relations with the EU than the one that we've unfortunately signed up to.
Okay. So a sense of creeping Europeanization
Yes.
coming our way.
Yeah, well, if we want to stay afloat.
Yeah, and that'll be the tricky bit. So we're coming towards the end. We've got a question from Ana Gonzalez, who quite rightly has raised the important issue that we have not yet mentioned about COP26. Well, our own George Eustace today, I think in the press, mentioned that he would buy a heat pump if he thought the technology was quite there yet. So he hasn't bought one because he's not too sure about it. Seemingly, I saw that on the news flash earlier. But question is there, will countries actually deliver what they promised? Or will this make international relations more tense than they are now? So a big question for the future.
Yes. Well, I've always been, ever since my teenage student days, a great believer in the extra parliamentary opposition. So I think that the public anger, especially amongst young people, based on the idea that the realization that the Earth's resources are finite is growing dramatically. In 1984, in the European Parliament, it was the first time the Greens were elected. I greeted that because I saw them filling a gap that needed filling on the political agenda. And well, 30 years isn't too long in politics. Now the Greens are going into coalition government in Europe's biggest economy. Now, I think these things speed up. I mentioned being in Poland in 1980 and seeing solidarity beginning, but never thinking it would unravel the Soviet system so quickly, really. 10 years is not a long time in history. I've lived through it. So I think the momentum is now rolling, and particularly the younger generations will not be put off. Now, as long as that is channeled, as it were, into rational protest, then again, they'll have to take note. The other one, of course, is that people want to win elections. And if people like Johnson thinks that Brexit will put them in number 10, it's not inconceivable that even within the existing parties, they don't come round to the idea that the key to number 10 and their seat in the ministerial limo depends on really doing something about the finite nature of the Earth's resources. That's a big incentive. So I think that the tide is moving the way of the progressive movements on the environmental agenda. And I think whatever the governments try to hold up, the momentum will prove strong. If it doesn't, then I think there could be serious political trouble. And I do then hope that the disillusionment or the understandable cynicism, skepticism about the intention of the leaders in Glasgow could turn sour or turn into disillusionment and giving up. But my hope isn't in Johnson or even Biden or even Scholz or Merkel. I just hope that the momentum is now running. I just hope it gathers speed. So yes, I'm on the side of those on the street who are protesting peacefully.
Good. We're coming towards the end of our session this evening, the time we had allocated. You just recently had a book published, Michael, haven't you? The Semi-detached European.
Okay. Yes.
And you reflect on that in the book. I've got the copy here beside me, and just reading the last kind of words on it. He said, however, Britain never quite lost the tag of being semi-detached, wanting to take the benefits, but not always wary of surrendering national sovereignty for the alleged greater good. So it's important in a way, when we're thinking, I suppose, about the UK, and you're thinking about that book, but also the UK's broader global ambitions. We're hosting COP26, very important that. But at the same time, we've cut our international development funding. We're a permanent 5 member of the United Nations. We're one of a small handful of countries that have a nuclear arsenal. So we have a global vision on the one hand, or do we have no vision at all?
Well, it's still you see, it is still very much the imperial vision of Britain leading the world and wanting to lead the world, or wanting to give the impression that it's leading the world. I think, excuse me, I think it's very difficult to give up this past grandeur and the illusion that we can still play that kind of role. And of course, it's been stoked up in this regressive way by the press and current politicians. So we're back to Acheson. It will take, I'm afraid, a short while, despite what I said about momentum on environmental matters. It will take a while and some effort for Britain to lose this illusion without making people feel uncomfortable or attacking that illusion, which offends their sense of their own nation. But in a way, not positive, but one consequence of Brexit is it will make us think a bit more. And when we realize that we can't do it alone and the world isn't waiting for us to tell them which way to go, then it will have to do that within an alliance. And to think that that alliance is in the South Pacific or even in the USA, of course, is nonsense. That alliance has to be some 20 odd kilometers or 30 kilometers across the channel. Europe has become much, much closer. And not like me in my generation, I studied in Germany, so I was doing German. Now, when I go around and talk to people in my area, they've studied hotel management in Spain. They've done sports medicine in France. They've done hotel business chef's courses in Denmark. So the younger, more European in a way than I was, because they've grown up in it. And I think that's something very positive. And I think that they will. That will filter through and change from what might be an initial disillusionment to let's do something positive, non-ideological, but practical about re-engaging with Europe.
Well, that is a very positive point to stop. I'm really grateful for the time that you've given us tonight.
Pleasure.
Grateful for participants who've posted questions and maybe just listened. Also grateful to the Former Members Association who helped to facilitate these events and put us in contact with individuals such as yourself, and also to our team at the university who are working into the later hours to ensure that the technology works. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. This, I believe, will also be available on our YouTube channel at some point in the next few days or so, once it's been uploaded and checked. So thanks again, and good evening, everyone.
And thank you very much on my behalf. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.